Good evening. I'm very happy to bid you all a very warm welcome to our first event of the DSA series, special DSA series of the digital platform. My name is Alexandra Gese. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens AFA Group, and I'm a co-chair of the digital working group of the Greens AFA Group, and I've been a shadow rapporteur for the DSA own initiative report of the CoE Committee. Good to see you all. I'm particularly happy to not to be here alone, but with great guests that I would like to introduce briefly before I start with my introductory remarks. And we have as a first speaker, Joe McNamee. Maybe you can say hi, Joe. Joe McNamee is currently working as an independent consultant on internet policy issues. He has worked on internet-related topics since 1995, when the internet was a very different thing from now, and when he worked for the world's second biggest internet service provider, CompuServe. He spent 11 years working on EU digital policy, first leading a political consultancy specializing in tech policy, and the last 9 years as executive director of the European Digital Rights Initiative. Of particular relevance for this evening's discussion, Joe is currently a member of the Council of Europe Committee on Automated Data Processing, where he was joint rapporteur for the Committee of Ministers' Recommendation on Human Rights Implication of Algorithmic Systems. He's a member of the Council of Europe's Committee on Freedom of Expression and Digital Technologies, where he's a rapporteur for guidelines on content moderation, and an observer member of the Council of Europe Committee on Internet Intermediaries. Welcome, Joe. Great to have you. Let me just have, okay, we all have people coming in. Perfect. Then we have Mackenzie Nelson. Hello, Mackenzie. Mackenzie Nelson is a researcher and project manager for the Governing Platforms project at Algorithm Watch, where she was in charge of the recently published recommendations putting meaningful transparency at the heart of the Digital Services Act. So that is really the topic of tonight. She holds an MA in Public Administration from the Central European University School of Public Policy and a BA in International Politics and History from Jacobs University Bremen. And prior to starting with Algorithm Watch, Mackenzie worked in transatlantic policy communication at the Heinrich Böll Foundation's office in Washington, D.C. Her current research focuses on public discourse, online intermediaries, and multi-stakeholder approaches to platform governance in the European Union. And then last but not least, we have Paddy Leerssen. Paddy Leerssen is a PhD candidate in information law at the University of Amsterdam and a non-resident fellow at Stanford's University Center for Internet and Society. His research focuses on the regulation of transparency in social media platforms. More specifically, his dissertation looks at the impacts of algorithmic content recommendations on the governance of media pluralism. So, distinguished guests, and dear participants, I'm very happy to speak tonight about the first topic of our series, which is algorithmic transparency. We all know that the Commission is going to come forward with a proposal for the Digital Services Act on 9th December. It was supposed to be December 2nd. Now it's December 9th. I think that is due to COVID. And therefore, I think everybody understands that the Commission is 1 week late. I really appreciate it's only 1 week considering the really dire situation we have in Brussels and in Belgium. And the Digital Services Act is going to reform the 20-year-old e-commerce directive. Therefore, it gives us the opportunity to completely rethink what we want our digital interconnected world to look like. So in this event series, we're going to deepen the discussion around 3 key elements that I deem indispensable for the upcoming legislation and that I have particularly been focusing on in my work and in the work of the Green Group in the Parliament, which is algorithmic transparency, strict boundaries for ad tech, and independent social media councils. So today we focus on transparency of algorithms, breaking the black box. Why am I so interested in that? Just an anecdote. There was an article a few months ago in the Wall Street Journal that said that 1/3 of Facebook groups have extremist content, and that 66% of the members of these groups are directed to those groups by the Facebook algorithm. So this is quite worrying. If we imagine that happening on a large scale, what does that mean for our societies? What does it mean for our democracies? I think we could watch what it means for our democracy following the US election, where we saw a group called Stop the Steal that grew from 0 to 200,000 members overnight, disseminating, saying that the votes were illegal, that it wasn't legal to keep counting the vote, which was clearly disinformation, and where even people were inciting everybody else to violence. And it took Facebook a long time to get this group off the net. And then there's a discussion, was that right to do it? So this really opens up enormous questions for us. The problem we have as policymakers when we try to regulate these issues is that we don't really have evidence. The evidence is all completely anecdotal. We have a little study here and a little study there. People say things about YouTube, and there's an article by Zeynep Tunevkeci. There are a few studies, but it's all very small, and the platforms tell us, well, yeah, but don't worry, we are fixing it. But what are they doing? We don't know, because academia doesn't have access to the data. We managed in the IMCO report, the IMCO is the Committee for the Internal Market and Consumer Protection of the European Parliament, to include an amendment that clearly calls on the Commission to increase transparency specifically for recommender algorithms. And this is what we want to talk about tonight, and to gain further insight in order to be able to come up with good legislation that really works in our offline and specifically in our online world. So before I start giving the floor to my guests, which I will soon do, I would like to point out that this is an interactive event, so you have the possibility to come in with questions in writing or orally. I would like to say that this event is being recorded, and we will use the recording. It will, people will be able to see it on my website. So if you don't want your voice to be heard or your image to be seen, please don't ask for the floor, but just put your question in writing. And please don't use the chat for that, but the Q&A tool, which you find on the bottom of your screen, probably according to the device you're using, but I suppose we are all used to using these video conferencing tools, and we all perfectly know where to put the question. So you can start writing your questions into the tool while our distinguished speakers are presenting their speeches. Is there anything else I have to say? No, I think that we're all okay. If you want to speak, if you want to come in with a question, you can raise your hand by clicking on the tool. It should be on the participants button, and there you find the possibility to raise your hand, and we will see that. And yeah, that was basically it. So we start with the introductory remarks by our speakers. They have 10 minutes each, and we start with Joe McNamee, who is going to give us a little bit the big picture and tell us a little bit about the ideas, the thinking they have at the Council of Europe that has done very commendable work on transparency, on algorithms, on artificial intelligence, and on all these debates. So thank you very much, Joe. You have the floor. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me? Great, I've had an impressive number of technical problems today. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. The introduction is a very good introduction and overview of the issues at stake. I was at a conference a few months ago where one of the speakers referred to the problems of keeping our open space, our open public space, as a genuine public space. Our public space is where our society thrives and where our democracy is rooted. Our public space has traditionally been made out of our personal interactions and out of the news media that needed to gain our trust to keep our business. We were the customers of the newspapers and the news media. Now, our primary view of our public space comes from the translation of the public space that we're presented with by social media platforms and search engines. Now, the surveillance capitalism companies have become the customers of the news websites rather than us. Far too often, this translation is a translation into desperanto. Despair and attention-grabbing headlines generate more clicks, more data, and therefore more revenue for surveillance capitalism. We are often presented with a version of our collective public space that's engineered to appeal to us and to our prejudices. Our neighbor is presented with a different public space that appeals to his or her prejudices, and their neighbor is presented with another version of the public space. You might call them the dialects of Desperanto. Our public space is now 1 million public spaces, 1 million different realities, a shattered mirror. As Alexandra said, we have some people presented with the reality where Trump won. Another set of people are presented with the reality where Trump lost. We're presented with one reality where COVID is a deadly disease, bringing our health systems to their knees. Another reality where it is only the flu and we are just postponing death by fighting it. We're presented with a reality where 5G is a wildly hyped technology for business reasons, and another one where it's hyped for misinformation reasons. So can transparency fix this problem with our public space? In my opinion, the answer seems to be no, and at least it's no without enforcement of competition rules, data protection rules, and transparency rules that go light years beyond the industry standard of we're doing this because we want to provide you with a better service that just happens to be more profitable. As Alexandra said, I had the honor first as a representative of European digital rights and later as the Irish State's nominee to take part in 3 expert groups of the Council of Europe working on these issues. These committees produced 2 Committee of Ministers recommendations and a 3rd one is pending. And they're all very relevant to this topic and need to be taken into account. The 2018 recommendation on rights and responsibilities of internet intermediaries is a strong document that makes some points that are often overlooked. Internet intermediaries often perform multiple tasks at the same time. They can resemble publishers in some functions, they can moderate and rank content, they can host content for us, and they can base their businesses on their exploitation of our personal data. Treating them as publishers for activities where they're not publishers will make these problems worse and not better. So it's crucial for the effectiveness, proportionality, and competition of that we target each activity specifically in order to avoid unintended consequences. The recommendation also stipulates that states should not exert pressure on internet intermediaries through non-legal means. So-called voluntary, so-called self-regulation coerced by states imposes restrictions on human rights that are not compatible with the rule of law. In relation to serious crime, such accountability-free measures are bordering on reckless. We see voluntary measures on terrorism, we see voluntary measures on child abuse, but do they actually work? Are they counterproductive? As Alexandra was saying about data, we don't have the data, we don't know. The 2002 and 2020 recommendation on algorithmic decision-making proposes that states should ensure that all design, development, and ongoing deployment of algorithmic systems provide an avenue for individuals to be informed in advance about the related data processing, including its purposes and possible outcomes, and to control their data, including through interoperability. And that private sector actors should extend access to all relevant individual data and metadata sets to appropriate parties, notably independent researchers, the media, and civil society organizations. This echoes what Alexandra was saying a moment ago, and it has already been accepted in the Committee of Ministers of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. This should not be a difficult task to overcome in the Digital Single Market Act. In other words, we need transparency that goes far beyond the bland, insulting transparency that we currently see, for example, in cookie banners, and instead create real informational self-determination. The third recommendation, which is at an early stage, is due to be completed in early 2022 and looks at the impact of digital technologies and freedom of expression. It addresses the issues from the perspective of the need for clarity on ranking and removing content, the need to find ways for protecting traditional media, transparency, accountability and redress, education and empowerment, multi-stakeholder governance, and supporting independent research. The committee is also working on guidelines for content moderation, and I have the honor of being the rapporteur for this document. This should be finished in March. And the committee is very focused on the issue of transparency around content moderation. And transparency about when content is restricted on the basis of terms of service or the law. Transparency that involves being clear about who is responsible for the restriction. Are the measures regulatory, self-regulatory, or co-regulatory? Transparency about the measures to effectively track the evolution of crimes, to ensure that restrictive measures that are imposed are not just effective when they're launched, but effective on a long-term basis. And transparency about expectations. When we implement measures to restrict content, what do we understand by success? What do we understand by failure? What do we understand by a failure that's such that we need to abandon the technology altogether? In sum, transparency is not a silver bullet that will solve all our problems, but transparency is also not something that will make something unacceptable, become acceptable because it is explained better. But transparency is an important tool. And we need, in conclusion, to ensure that we address all aspects of transparency and make sure that we're delivering what's needed for the rights of European citizens and European businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think that was a perfect introduction, and seeing the big picture, which is always important. So I would like to give the floor to Paddy, Paddy Leerssen. Go ahead.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Perfect. So thank you so much for having me here. It's an absolute honor and a pleasure. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So there are three things I'd like to discuss today in the context of this topic of transparency in recommender systems. The first is, why does it matter? Why is this important to have? The second is, what do we want to know? What will that transparency, should that entail? And then third, who should we design these remedies for? So the why, the what, and the who of transparency in recommender systems. And to start with the first one, why this matters. I think we can start by now in Brussels. I get the feeling with the consensus that when it comes to dominant online platforms, they need to be more transparent and more accountable about their influence on online freedom of expression, online media. That is something that seems more or less uncontroversial by now. However, my concern is that a lot of the efforts in this space still tend to focus on platforms in one particular form of influence, and that is content removal. And that may have been the right thing to focus on 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but by now, platforms increasingly have much more sophisticated and more subtle ways of influencing online speech. Most importantly, their recommender systems. Increasingly, these are being used to moderate content. How they do that is not by making things less accessible, but by making them less visible. And this is done in specific instances where they will downrank content or blacklist an account where it becomes harder to find, or they will whitelist accounts so that they gain priority over others. What they also do is systemically that they can change the priorities of the algorithm to create different outcomes. So for example, Facebook changed in 2015, 2016, the well-known pivot to video, which prioritized video content and suddenly created major problems for journalists. And so if you're just looking at removal, you're missing all of these other ways in which platforms are influencing speech. And what's interesting here is that downranking is presented by platforms as a less restrictive measure, something that is increasingly applied in the more controversial cases. The things that are not clearly unlawful, do not clearly violate the platform's terms, but are nonetheless considered, for whatever reasons, unwelcome, unsatisfactory, or what Facebook calls borderline content. However, there are nonetheless very clear free speech threats here. Facebook's own data shows that a downranking measure can reduce the traffic for a piece of content by up to 80%, right? And although the content remains accessible, I want to suggest to you that this is not a less restrictive measure, but in many cases is something that we should be even more worried about. This increasing shift towards content moderation and what they call curation through the recommender system. And that's for two reasons. First of all, it's precisely because it's being applied in the controversial, in the borderline cases, where this is content that may not clearly violate any particular rule, or you could go either way about, and nonetheless, a sanction is being applied. And the second reason, which I think might be even the more important one in the context of today's discussion, is that this intervention is less easy to detect than when you just remove the content. So this is probably easy to imagine, right? If, say, an influential YouTube account is deleted, this will be immediately apparent for the operator, for his audience. But if they are blacklisted so that their content doesn't really show up in search results anymore, doesn't show up in recommendations anymore, and their traffic collapses, it's much harder to figure out that the platform did this. So in this sense, it's harder to detect. And for this reason, I think transparency in recommender systems is such a crucial aspect if we want to get this right, if we want any of this to be accountable. So what does that look like? What does transparency in recommender systems look like? What do we want to know? The major point I want to make here, unfortunately in the 10 minutes here, I can't go into too much detail about what kinds of data disclosures are needed. I can refer you to my papers on this topic if you are interested in the details. But the main point I want to make is that we shouldn't focus exclusively on the algorithm. Instead of talking about recommendation algorithms exclusively, we should talk about recommender systems. Why do I say that? First of all, well, not only is it the case that these algorithms are extremely complex and difficult to explain, that is something I'm guessing that many of you will be familiar with, the explainability challenges in AI. My point is that even if we could explain that in a way which is meaningful to people, you're still not going to have a satisfactory answer or explanation for many of the phenomena that we are worried about. And this is because the algorithm as such doesn't tell you what is going to be recommended, because that also depends crucially on what user behavior is. What content are users uploading? What are they watching? What are they liking? What are they subscribing to? All these factors are extremely important in determining what ultimately ends up being recommended. And as you can imagine, that aspect of user behavior is extremely unpredictable, and it differs extremely between different communities, between different age groups, between different platforms. And for that reason, if you just get a mathematical description of what the algorithm looks like, you still have no idea what results that is going to be leading to in practice. To understand that impact in practice, you also need a better view of the outputs, the simple question of who is being recommended what, who is seeing what. And that is something that's actually very difficult to study as well. Many watchdogs have tried to document this, but in many cases, this is made difficult by the platforms. And in this sense, the situation is much worse than the conventional black box metaphor. It's not just that the algorithm in the black box is unknown, it's that the actual decisions that are coming out of this box are opaque as well. So getting a better view of the outputs is essential to understanding these systems. In addition, there's also the fact that platforms are constantly intervening with these automated recommender systems. As I outlined previously, we have this blacklisting and whitelisting that occurs. We have these larger scale reorientations of the recommender system's priority. These are things that can and should be documented and explained. And if you just ask for mathematical documentation of the algorithm as such, you don't know which accounts are on the blacklist, which accounts are on the whitelist, and so forth. So again, all these things together mean that we need to talk about regulating transparency in recommender systems and not just the recommender algorithm. So then, who are we doing this for? As I said, I don't have time to get into all the details of all the different types of data that would be interesting to disclose to different people. But ultimately, the key question that informs the design of transparency solutions is what your audience is. And the growing consensus in the literature here from academics is that this is needs to be a tiered system where different stakeholders get different forms of transparency. But first of all, one of the most important groups is users, right, who deserve notice and explanation rights when their content as an uploader is affected, is being downranked, is being flagged in the system, or maybe even prioritized. And the same is true for the audiences who try to access this content and need to understand how these systems work. A starting point here is the platform to business regulation, which has some semblance of these kinds of rights, but this is something that can obviously be expanded in terms of its scope, as well as the substance of the information rights involved. Another group is regulators. The most obvious ones here are competition regulators who need access to data about recommender systems in order to, for example, enforce rules on self-preferencing in competition law and whatever else comes out of the DSA here. So concretely, which regulators are involved and which data will be needed will depend on which norms end up applying to recommender systems in the DSA. One point I will make, however, is that the DSA could also play a role in facilitating data access for national level regulators. I'm thinking here particularly of media regulators. The EU does not have a media regulator, but many media regulators are extremely interested in recommender systems and how they affect media pluralism, for example. And creating structures for them to be able to access the data they need is perhaps also something the DSA should include. And then finally, I want to emphasize the importance of data access for the public in a more general sense, including civil society, academia, journalism, and so forth. And this is, I would submit, particularly the case when we're talking about media platforms. Not so much necessarily e-commerce platforms like Amazon or gig economy platforms like Uber. With media, it's especially important that what policy ends up occurring, whether it's implemented by platforms or whether it's mandated by government regulators, that this policy is visible and subject to democratic accountability. And this boils down to a matter of trust. We trust the government to some extent to determine what the public interest is when it comes to retail or when it comes to taxi rides. But we do not trust the government to the same degree when we're talking about determining the public interest when it comes to the news, when it comes to media. And because of this unique sensitive nature of media governance, there is an especially high need for data access for journalists, academics, and other independent civil society watchdogs. And I believe that's something that Mackenzie will be talking about as well. So I'll leave the details for her. The final comment, which I'll leave you with, perhaps it was obvious, I don't know, is that this is all very complicated. Designing transparency systems for transparency solutions for recommender systems is a very technical topic. And for that reason, the appropriate response, I believe, is not to try to create a one-size-fits-all solution within the DSA. It is instead to create broad standards which can then be worked out in further detail by a competent regulator. Otherwise, it'll be extremely difficult to develop effective and meaningful solutions exhaustively in legislative text. I'll leave it here for now. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Paddy. I already have a lot of questions, but I would like to remind the audience of the fact that they can already write their questions into the Q&A tool. I mean, I'm just writing everywhere already. So if you don't do that, I will be asking all the questions. But before we come to the questions, I would like to give the floor to Mackenzie Nelson, who has come up with Algorithm Watch with sort of already a model of how this kind of transparency could work that I think is very, very impressive, because every time we brought up transparency for recommending systems in the Parliament Committee, someone would say, oh no, but those are trade secrets, that's not possible. Apart from there being an issue of priorities, are trade secrets more important than maintaining and conserving and protecting democracy, which is a question I would like to ask, but I think there are ways to sort of reconcile all these different interests. And I think what Algorithm Watch, or the Governing Platforms Project, has come up with is really very interesting, and therefore Mackenzie has the floor to present it to us. I think you need to be unmuted or unmute yourself.
Here
you go.
I tried to unmute myself, but I guess I needed to be unmuted. Yeah, so my name is Mackenzie Nelson, and thanks, Alexandra, for the invitation and the opportunity to be presenting our recommendations from the Governing Platforms Project. Full transparency, pun intended, that Paddy worked closely on these as well. Together with some other researchers, Jeff Auslos at the University of Amsterdam. Maybe I'll just tell you very briefly about Algorithm Watch, who we are, for those of you who aren't familiar with our work. We're a nonprofit research and advocacy organization based out of Berlin. And our Governing Platforms Project was a year-long civil society dialogue series. We worked with researchers at the University of Amsterdam, as I mentioned, but also at the Mainz Media Institute to come up with recommendations for how to go about tackling issues like hate speech, disinformation, and other challenges to the public sphere. So today I'm going to be presenting these recommendations, which were co-signed by a number of leading civil society organizations, but also academics, which we think speaks to the importance and also the broad acceptance among different stakeholders of having better transparency around algorithmic systems. And I'll be telling you about why data access matters. We've already heard it as a buzzword, and why we can't really have meaningful transparency without it. I'll also apologize in advance to those of you who've already seen or heard this stump speech, but the good news is that I come bearing visualizations, so my hope is that it won't be too unbearable to be seeing the slide deck for a second time. But I thought that I would kick things off with a little story. And it's a story about a data scientist working for a watchdog organization conducting research on hate speech and disinformation. And this researcher reached out to us over the summer and told us that she started working on these topics because she was really concerned about some of the issues that we've already touched upon, that the algorithms that platforms use to curate, rank, and remove content online were sowing up hate and division, that they were creating social polarization, and that they were facilitating the spread of disinformation. And this watchdog told us that she was also concerned by what she saw as a lack of evidence in policy discussions about how to address these issues, something that Alexandra already mentioned at the beginning of her introductory remarks. And she wanted to do her part to try to shed light on what was going on within these black box systems. So what she did was she reached out to the platform, as most researchers in her position usually do, and she applied to access its application programming interface, which would give her access to the information that she would need in order to kind of reverse engineer and understand how platforms were shaping public discourse online. And to gain access to this data, she had to jump through all kinds of hoops. She had to submit multiple requests to multiple corporate spokespeople, and it took months of persistence and waiting. But eventually she did manage to get access to the API. And unfortunately, it wasn't really nearly as helpful as she had hoped. It was extremely restrictive, both in terms of the volume of data that she was able to download, but also it was really buggy, difficult to work with. It changed frequently and without notice. And the whole process, both from waiting for the data to actually getting the data, left her pretty frustrated and demoralized, and also unable to answer the questions that she initially set out to answer about how these algorithmic black boxes were working. So why am I telling you about this? I'm telling you this story because unfortunately it's not a one-off example. It's just the tip of the iceberg. And every watchdog who works in this space has a similar battle story, and they face a similar dilemma. If you work with the platforms, either through research partnerships such as Social Science One, or transparency reports and data sets, chances are you don't get access to the information that you need. And if you try to work around the platforms by building tools like we do at Algorithm Watch, that I'm also happy to tell you more about, you might run into legal challenges over terms of service violations. And I'm sure that if you've been following the most recent scandal with the researchers from New York University, they could tell you a mouthful on this. So the situation that we're left with is that at the moment, watchdogs are completely reliant on platforms' goodwill to get access to the data that they need to understand how technology is shaping democracy. And stories like this show that platform self-regulatory transparency alone just isn't good enough. If we want to understand algorithmic decision-making systems or AI, if we want to detect online harms, and if we want to provide policymakers with the evidence that they need to make informed decisions, what we need to do is we need to move beyond the buzzwords. And that's where we think the DSA comes in. Where's our DSA? We think that the DSA is an opportunity for Europe to really set the gold standard in platform regulation by tackling the information asymmetries that are preventing us from understanding what's going on in the digital public square. And that's why we're asking EU legislators to introduce binding rules that outline who can directly access data or apply for access to platform data. We're asking legislators to base any disclosure obligations off of the technical functionalities of a platform service, because we need information about micro-targeting, we need information about ranking, about content moderation, recommendations. I think Paddy's made the case there. And it's clear that we can't rely on platforms to come up with their own definitions about what is and is not political or mark their own homework. We're asking for an independent institution where we think of it as a one-stop shop to act as an intermediary between the intermediaries and the watchdogs. And what we want this independent institution to do is to maintain any kind of relevant data access infrastructure. So that would be public databases, different forums, virtual secure operating environments for more sensitive data. And we want this institution, sorry, this is a pretty big visual, happy to break it down maybe during the discussion, but we want it to collaborate with multiple EU and national level data protection authorities, cybersecurity agencies, media regulators, and other competent authorities to ensure that there's appropriate levels of independence and oversight. And because, of course, data is only useful for those who know how to use it, we're also asking the institution to proactively support watchdogs so that they can make use of these tools through, for example, independent centers of AI and ADM, which we've proposed together for the Commission's in response to the Commission's white paper with Access Now. And of course, because of the sensitive nature of certain types of data, there are legitimate concerns to be raised regarding threats to user privacy. So we think it's really important that this institution upholds the GDPR's principles And the good news is that we've shown in our workshop or through our research that the GDPR doesn't need to be seen as an obstacle, and it doesn't need to stand in the way of meaningful research access to platform data. So that's why we're asking policymakers to learn from other sectors. We think there are some really good examples in the health sector, and to integrate those best practices from those sectors to ensure that citizens can exercise their rights in an easy manner. Because the bottom line is that it shouldn't be easier for researchers to access sensitive health data than it is to access data about online advertising. In short, we're asking policymakers to make sure that transparency of algorithms isn't just an empty buzzword. Meaningful transparency, as we've already heard, is going to be hard. It needs to be designed carefully, and it will take a lot of resources to get it right. But we think that Europe needs to get it right, and that the DSA offers an opportunity to get it right. Because I hope that by now I've managed to convince everyone, and I think our previous speakers as well have convinced us that a healthy democracy really depends on a strong and healthy public sphere, and most importantly, a strong and healthy fourth estate. And we can only have a strong and healthy fourth estate when watchdogs are free to speak truth to power and understand the very heart of the public square that is the digital democracy. And if you would like to learn more about our recommendations and read them in non-cartoon form, I guess I can pop them into the chat. And I'm looking forward to discussing with the other panelists. That's all from me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mackenzie. I would just start with a few questions myself. We already have a few in the chat, and participants have the possibility to raise their hands. In order to do that, click on the bottom of your screen on participants, and then you see the little window with the list, and there you can click on raise hand, and we will see that and have a speaking list, make a speaking list. There's one thing from a European point of view, Mackenzie. Put these questions away because I can't see it. This transparency facilitator, which I think is a really fascinating idea. Have you given any thought to where that would be located? Would that be like a new European agency or something? Or could you see it within the institutional framework already existing? I mean, I realize that's maybe our task as politicians, but have you given that any thought?
So I think it's a really key question. And from what I understand, it's going to be one of the biggest battlegrounds for the DSA. And there's some discussion also within civil society about whether or not it makes sense to have a full-on European regulator. This is a question that we, together with our group of civil society organizations, didn't really go into so much. But, and I think maybe Paddy could speak to this as well. One thing that was clear to us is that it makes sense to have at least a transparency body as a European body. And it also is important that I think we apply the lessons learned from the GDPR, that we have strong enforcement. In terms of our position as Algorithm Watch about whether or not it makes sense to have a full-blown regulator, that's not something that we've yet really taken a firm position on. But we think that at least the transparency question is something that should be tackled at the union level.
Well, probably if we go for your model, we should have a regulator on the one hand and the transparency facilitator. I mean, that maybe shouldn't be the same authority, or that would be my idea, you know, in order to make sure it's really independent. But maybe this is going too much into the political aspects, but having to legislate then on that.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your take, Paddy. I mean, you're the moderator, Alexandra, but I know that Paddy and we've had conversations about this.
Okay, go ahead, Paddy.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I was just about to make the point that Alexandra then made, which is that I think one of the important points to emphasize is that the regulatory competence in terms of the substance can be separated to the degree from the transparency responsibilities. And that's something I alluded to with the distinction of the national media authorities and then an EU level transparency facilitator. And that's true across other fields as well. I don't have a firm position as to who specifically should be responsible for transparency within the EU institutions. I'll just have to be honest that that's outside the research I've done so far, and I'll just stick to the stuff that I have a well-researched opinion on. But what I can point out is that regulatory oversight will be needed. This is a problem you see with other areas where people will have some kind of information right, but if they do not have a structure supporting it that is able to enforce that on an ongoing basis, if every individual is left for themselves to sue the platform if the disclosures aren't up to scratch, let alone being able to verify whether they even are in the first place, that is the kind of thing that is very difficult for other stakeholders to do. And that is one reason why having a regulator in this space is so important. And the other reason is that the platforms will need close guidance on these issues. This is because every platform is very different. Now, this is something we've seen come up in the content moderation debate. There will be broad principles about how to disclose content removal issues or something like this, but every platform has a slightly different way of counting what a post is, or what a view is, or how something is removed. And this makes it very difficult to draft consistent rules that apply across platforms and over time, because these same platforms are also constantly changing in how they work. And because of this dynamic and heterogeneous landscape, there's no way of capturing all of that in legislation in a way that can't easily be undermined. And therefore you need a regulator that can translate those broad standards into specific guidance for individual platforms. And the way you reduce their workload and make this manageable is that you focus these transparency requirements on a small handful of dominant platforms. I think that's something that was also mentioned in one of the Q&A questions. It doesn't make sense from a transparency perspective to apply all those same high level, demanding transparency rules on small platforms as well. So you don't get a GDPR type situation where one regulator has to enforce against all of society and gets impossibly overloaded with enforcement tasks. They can focus on maybe a dozen platforms, depending on how you scope it, making it a much more manageable task.
Yeah, thank you very much. Joe, did you want to come in on this debate on the regulator body and the transparency facilitator, or from a point of view of the Council of Europe? Is that something relevant?
It's not something that has come up in any discussions that I've been involved in. I think I would sign up to everything that the other two speakers said, although I'm a little bit more cynical about the efforts that market players have engaged in with regard to transparency. If you read the Facebook and Google the transparency reports under NetzDG, Facebook's is simply better than Google's, and there's just, I don't normally spend a lot of time praising Facebook, but the rule is the same. The rule is fairly simple and straightforward, and it should be possible across all of the relevant industry players that are covered by NetzDG, who have the same rule being applied to them, to have consistent across industry and consistent across time transparency reports. So I think we're fighting against an element of awkwardness on behalf of industry sometimes too.
Absolutely, yeah. In a minute, I would give the floor to Nina. So I would ask Jana, my team member, to unmute Nina. And I saw a second hand by Peter, which I'm not seeing anymore. So if you want to speak, Peter, just click again on raise hand. And I have a question before really opening it up to Paddy. You said, and I know that's something Germans really care a lot about, and you talked about media pluralism and transparency and giving the data to media regulators could help to provide for media pluralism. And I think that was discussed by the Commission as well, which was quite interested in, be forthcoming on this, but didn't really know how to do this. So maybe could you elaborate a little bit on that, how to promote media pluralism by transparency?
Well, I think this is a really good question, and like many good questions, it has a very, it's not easy to answer. I think, well, it's true. This is definitely something that's, very topical in Germany right now, where this Medienstaatsvertrag is actually trying to some extent to apply diversity requirements to platforms. And indeed, increasingly, media pluralism, which is something that has been part of government policy for decades, if not centuries, is something that is under threat by recommender systems, which may not be as plural as the underlying media landscape. In terms of transparency, one of the difficulties here is that media pluralism sounds like a concept that everyone agrees on, but in fact, when you look at it in practice, it can have many different interpretations, right? Are you looking at the number of outlets in terms of diversity? Are you looking at the number of political viewpoints? And if so, which ones deserve to be included? Are you looking at genres? Like, should it be, is it news versus entertainment, for example? And finally, what is diverse? Mathematically speaking, you could have, there's different ways of accounting for that. So for all these reasons, that is difficult to trace as well. And again, I come back to the point I made earlier, which is that to the extent that governments want to take this on, this extremely political and sensitive topic, perhaps that is preferable than to relying exclusively on the self-regulation by the platforms. But it is essential then that others can see what demands are being made, how they're implemented by the platform, and what the results are. What ultimately becomes the landscape that we have. Right now, none of those questions can really be answered. And I would say, therefore, that having adequate transparency, especially towards civil society actors and towards the public in these systems, is really a precondition for making, for legitimizing any attempt by government to start to interfere in that media pluralism debate.
May I would just like to take a question from the written questions before giving the floor to Nina, because that really fits in perfectly, and it's a question directed to you, a question by Ralph. It says, could or should we also regulate the goals towards which the recommendation systems are optimized to? And that's really a crucial question, I think.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And, effectively, that is also what you see in these media pluralism debates, right? That diversity, our quality of recommendations becomes an additional requirement, our goal, next to the ones that we already know that the platforms reward, such as engagement or ad revenue, for example. So I think that's something that's being attempted, and it's not for me to say whether we should, I think, but it's something that seems to be relatively uncontroversial as a principle, at least. So yeah, that is something that's actually happening. I will say that I'm just going over my notes here. When it comes to regulating goals, it's also something that the platform to business regulation has something of when it comes to transparency, right? So the transparency obligations under platform to business require the platform to describe the most important factors that influence your ranking. So effectively, that's quite similar to describing the goals that are being optimized for. So if you're curious about these things and want to see how platforms might respond to such a rule, I think studying how the platform to business regulation is being implemented would be a good first start.
Yeah, thank you. Just to mention that, I think we will be coming back to that debate. So what do you do with the results of transparency, the third event of the series, which is going to take place on Thursday night? And I'm very happy to announce that Roger McNamee will be participating from the Real Facebook Oversight Board, because there we will discuss whether social media councils in different forms and shapes would be a good way to deal with the results of transparency. When journalists work on it, watchdogs work on it, at a certain point you have results, and then you have to decide, what are the goals supposed to be? What do we want the companies to do? What do we want to optimize for? I mean, this is the ultimate goal. So I think at a certain point, we have to ask that question. And I think we agreed that we don't want governments to do that, but we still want a democratic process. So if you want to look more into this question, join us again in a couple of days on Thursday night. And we will have, I will speak about that event later again, but we'll have great guests and it will be a very interesting discussion. But let's get back to the basis, transparency, and Nina has the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Right. Hi, my name is Nina. I work for MEP Marianne Lind, SMG members on the Tran and MP committee. And she is now the rapporteur for the Tran opinion on platform workers' rights. And so I'm very interested in this question, or this discussion you're having on this agency, especially when we discuss workers' rights. It's a big issue of also having to regulate the algorithm. Some of the multiple issues that we face in gig economy of sort of non-standard forms of work has to do with both pay, but also who actually gets the jobs, right? So for pay, this is very regularly defined by, say, active time on platform, or not by time, but maybe by distance. And these things can be changed algorithmically, right, without consent from the actual gig workers. The same thing about who gets the job. So if you are a driver, or if you are a cleaning lady on a platform, how do you know whether or why you get the job, or another gig worker gets it? And how do we actually ensure non-discrimination if we don't have access to, if regulators don't have access to the algorithms and how to actually read them? And so this is sort of an open question about what are actually the possibilities of gaining access to algorithms of these big companies, right? Because I would imagine there are big issues also that being determined as private property of some sort, right, or intellectual property, and also, and so the second question is that something that can be done with the argument of regulatory enforcement, right? If we start to talk about this questions about minimum wage, right, in Europe, how do you then ensure a minimum wage on platforms when we don't know how the wage is actually set? So sort of more concretely, is it actually possible to sort of force access to algorithms, or does it have to be voluntary? And thank you for great presentations too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nina. I think that was a very relevant question. I mean, how do you deal with workers' rights? How can you enforce workers' rights and fairness in the workplace? How can you enforce labor law, like the one on minimum wages? Which I'm not sure whether this will be dealt with within the Digital Services Act, but it's absolutely important. Who would like to answer that? Mackenzie, go ahead.
Yeah, as you were speaking, and I think I also saw this in the chat box, and I thought it was a really interesting question. And when we were discussing kind of the scope of what we could or the scope of our recommendations, in the end, we focused mostly, or we had in the back of our mind, content hosting intermediaries, because that was the scope of our project. But we were pretty open also that such a framework would be useful for understanding any kind of algorithmic system. So I saw over the summer, there was a study that was published by researchers from Cornell University. And basically their study found that Uber's wages were fair, and that that their workers were making solid wages. And the interesting thing to me about the study was that it was actually conducted through a cooperation with Uber. So Uber provided them with the data. And I think that speaks to also some of the problems that we see when you're researching Facebook, or really it's any platform. We did a campaign over the summer, a Researchers on Red campaign, where we wanted to kind of probe and better understand. And that's also where the anecdote came from that my presentation was based off of. But I think that this is a problem not just in the content hosting platform space, but also on gig economy platforms. And if we're talking about workers' rights and collective bargaining, a prerequisite for that is going to be information. Think about like going into a salary negotiation. You need to know, and also people who are, you know, thinking about gender inequalities, they'll always say it's really important to have transparency around what wages are when you go into a negotiation. And I think the same is going to be true also in digital spaces. I think we're struggling also in analog spaces to have better transparency around wages. But it's something that we should have in mind as well for these other discussions.
Go ahead, Paddy.
I think Mackenzie put that very well, so I won't go into too much detail. But on that final point, you know, the question is, what is the role of voluntary disclosures? I think we can sum up the reason why this transparency is something to be regulated rather than done voluntarily for two reasons. The first is one that Mackenzie already mentioned, is that a voluntary disclosure is always going to be inherently suspect because the independence of the research can be called into question. You know, there's the adage, you know, only the approved questions are getting answered when it's voluntary. So you don't know what you're not getting. There's no guarantee that the hard stuff isn't being left out. The second one is what you alluded to about, well, what about trade secrets or intellectual property? Another argument you hear a lot is data protection law. So Social Science 1, which is Facebook's leading data sharing project with academics, basically fell apart because Facebook said there were GDPR problems. The academics involved didn't share those GDPR concerns. Nonetheless, Facebook said it was a problem. And the problem there is that we can't necessarily trust the arguments that the platforms are giving, right? And the benefit of regulation is that you then can take away those concerns. So for example, if you say, oh, we lack a processing ground under GDPR, well, if there's a legal duty to disclose, then there's your processing ground under GDPR, right? End of discussion. And for the same reason, you can make an exemption to trade secrecy rules if that is something that they're complaining about. The flip side of that is that regulation should provide safeguards. So of course, when it comes to privacy, there needs to be safeguards that the data isn't abused, etc. But those are the two reasons why voluntary won't work and regulation can.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that this brings up two questions that we are dealing with anyway. I mean, one is really the lack of independent expertise. That's in the digital area. It really is a problem because even all the important universities, I mean, that work on digital affairs are usually co-funded or by Google or by Facebook or some other companies. So that really is something I'm struggling with currently. And we need to do something about that. It's a different discussion, but it really is a discussion that we need to have. The other one, I would just like briefly to come back on the size of the companies we need the transparency requirements for, because you said before, and well, it's just, you know, the dozen biggest companies, but when we start speaking about workers' rights or about transparency for gender inequality reasons, for example, and in Germany, this is a big issue. Most people work in small or medium-sized companies. And it would be easy then, you know, to break up companies, to keep them small in order to stay below the radar. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind as well. Maybe if it's social media, it's different, but well, even there could be problems with smaller firms. And this is really an interesting question because from a legislative point of view, the Commission has to decide if it puts transparency requirements somewhere, whether to put them in the Digital Services Act, which should generally apply to all digital services or service providers, or in the Digital Markets Act that deals more with the competition issues. So that's quite relevant. And from this considerations on labor law, I would think, well, we need to have the possibilities to make transparency requirements apply to smaller companies as well. But then we have to deal with, you know, not having to add too much administrative burden for companies where it's not relevant. So I think we need to give this further thought where it's relevant and where not. But I would like to take Peter's question. Jana, could you unmute Peter? And then we have Mark after that. So you could prepare. Okay, Peter, go ahead. We can't hear you. You're unmuted, but we're not hearing you. No. Well, I'll take a written question in the meantime while you try to fix your mic issues. There was a question from the beginning that I think was interesting from Jillian from Boyk's group. And it says, what is your view on the EPP, so the Conservative Christian Democrat Party in the European Parliament, position on algorithmic transparency, which says that transparency requirements for platforms should include the underlying source codes of algorithmic processes that handle the content, and that the compliance with these additional transparency and explainability requirements shall fall under the competence of market surveillance authorities. Thank you very much. She's saying it has been seen and detailed by Politico today. It's a draft EPP position. This is interesting. Who would like to answer that? Paddy, go ahead.
So I haven't seen the position yet. I guess it came out today. So caveat that I'll still need to read it. But I think there are kind of two parts to this question. The first is the source code, and then there's the competence, like under which authority it comes. And the source code, so the main counter argument from the platforms is that if we reveal our source code, then it'll lose its function to the degree that bad actors can manipulate the recommender system. So for example, spammers can target directly the things that are being weighted and will undermine effectively the utility of the algorithm. The lawyerly answer to whether that's true is it depends. Commentators like Frank Pasquale from the United States is very skeptical about these arguments, and that in many cases, even if you know the algorithm, for example, if you know that you need likes to get exposure, how do you get likes? That by making good content, right? So that doesn't necessarily, once you know the algorithm, enable you to completely undermine the system. So it's kind of a case-by-case thing. Like a counterexample would be that in certain recommender systems, specific phrases are automatically being punished, right? And if you know what those phrases are as a spammer, you can avoid them, right? So there are certain cases in which that's true, in other cases where it's not. So one partial solution to that problem is that you could say, whatever regulator there is can take a confidential look at this information, and then and if the platform then chooses that certain parts need to remain confidential, then they can assess those arguments because they can actually see it. And on that basis, they can then determine how much of that is subsequently made public. So there might be a solution there in terms of figuring out which parts of the source code can be disclosed and which cannot. More importantly, though, as I hope I've made clear in my presentation, I think in many cases that this won't be enough. Right, so that while the source code might be relevant and interesting, it will not be enough. First of all, because there are these other aspects of the recommender system that play an important role. And also it's worth adding that this is where you get into the computer science of it. And my knowledge is somewhat limited, but what I hear from computer scientists is that when it comes to machine learning systems, you have the source code of the algorithm, but there's how that algorithm ultimately performs is very much determined by the training data, the data sets on which it is trained. And then if you don't disclose that, again, the source code won't tell you very much even about the algorithm, how it works. So those are the reflections again. And then there's the question whether that should be under the market authority or some other authority. I don't have a firm position on that myself, but I think Alexandra raised the right questions on this issue.
Anybody else want to come in on this question? I'm sorry. I would try to unmute Mark, who's next on the list. Peter has vanished somewhere nowhere again. If you want to speak, raise your hand again, and we try Mark. Joe, in the meantime, is sharing the Council of Europe recommendations on automated decision-making, which I suppose say that you should look at the whole system and not only at the code or the algorithm, which is what we asked for as well. Mark.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, how are you? Alexander, thank you very much for putting together this panel. Mine's more a comment. So I'm coming from 16, 17 years in development finance and development. And this discussion reminds me of the advent of financial markets when you're thinking about how to put together a regulatory infrastructure. And that's the point of where we're at. So of course, there are all these complexities. But I think ultimately there's going to be 10 years from now, a proper regulatory infrastructure to supervise, regulate for information/data. And when I think about a certain point that Paddy referred to, which was disclosures and voluntary disclosures, of course, small banking institutions have to make disclosures. And for the most part, they're voluntary. But when a supervisor can ad hoc supervise and finds that they haven't made all the disclosures they should have made, then there's a fine. So it's a sort of similar process to that may result whenever the infrastructure is in place. So I think that, again, the EU can really set the bar in terms of, with this DSA, start the first step in having a proper infrastructure in place, because social media companies and platforms will never have the power they have now. And I think it's kind of a bit of the wild, wild west. It's like, if I use an analogy, and those of us who are Irish on this call will probably be able to understand where I'm coming from, but look at how Dublin was used for the banking and financial system pre-crisis. It was recognized as a sort of regulatory-free Wild West. Obviously, that's since changed. But yeah, it's just a point around the fact that we're at that discussion where we're talking about the macro infrastructure that will need to be in place. And of course, your Googles and Facebooks will do all they possibly can to form a bulwark against it. But yes, again, thanks very much for having this discussion. It's very interesting.
Thank you, Mark. Well, the finance industry and its regulation is really something we've been trying to look into. It's complicated as well, but I think it's one of an example of the industries that are, well, not regulated well enough, but there's a lot of effort that has been made that has improved the situation. I think the difference I noted is that there you have financial actors like banks and insurances that in the end, even if there is just some regulation, have an interest in being regulated in some way, because it's good for them in the end to sort of get rid of competition that works with less cleaner methods and so on. And you have clients also who are very interested, have a strong financial interest in having banks and insurances and the whole finance industry regulated. While in the digital area, especially in social networks, as Joe, I think in the beginning pointed out, we are not the clients, we're the products. And that does make a difference, actually, I think. But who would like to come in on this question? Did I see Paddy? Yeah, Paddy and Mackenzie.
Yeah, just very briefly, I would kind of emphasize your points as well. I think there's some sense in looking at experiences in other areas of regulation, and finance is definitely one of them. Certainly, as you alluded to, in the area with the risks of regulatory capture. But I think there are limits to the analogy when it comes to size-based regulation, because a small bank is still a very significant institution, whereas a small website is not at all in most cases, right? So the small fish are much smaller in this digital market. And so I think we need to be even more careful about undermining or overburdening these smaller services, when really, perhaps even more so than banking, I wouldn't know the numbers, there are these few dominant players who really determine, who really raise the most public interest concerns.
Did you want to come in on this, Mackenzie?
No, I just wanted to sort of echo this idea that we can, just because we're thinking about new types of industries, so I don't have a tech policy background necessarily. And I think that when I first started thinking about these problems, I was like, whoa, AI, it sounds very scary. It sounds very complicated. And then as I started to dig into what are these technologies that we're actually talking about, you kind of see, oh, we're talking about predictive analytics. Predictive analytics has been used in insurance for years. And so I think that part of our task is also as civil society is communicating or doing a little bit of demystifying about what the technologies actually are, what they're capable of, and what some of the risks are, and how we can create regulatory frameworks that help to mitigate some of those risks. And so I think that what we tried to do also together with Paddy for our study was to say, what are people doing in transparency in other sectors? What are some of the pitfalls as well? So there are some organizations who are now entering the digital space who have a lot of experience in environmental corruption, and they've said, hey, listen, here are some of the lessons that we've learned from trying to create transparency in the environmental space, and you guys should be thinking about this as well when you're moving forward with pushing for greater platform transparency. So I think that we should have our ears open as kind of the tech policy bubble to other people's experiences from other sectors, and also have the humility to say that our issues aren't, somehow extra special or extra different. Policy is, I think, complex, and we need to have the complexity of the issues reflected in the type of policies that we create. But it shouldn't stop us or paralyze us in any way from tackling these, bigger challenges.
I totally agree. Joe, would you like to make a few remarks on this issue as well?
Yeah, I think it's a interesting and important question. In the Council of Europe recommendation, it looked at high risk versus other types of activities. So rather than looking at the size of the business, it was the potential impact that it was going to have on the rights of individuals. And I think that might be a more sensible way to look at it. When it comes to content curation, content moderation, and recommender systems, we need to remember that even if we just look at this narrowly without looking at the impact on, for example, labor rights, a private company, an online platform might be moderating and curating content on the basis of what is going to be interesting or important for advertisers, the relevance of a specialized social media platform that only wants to focus on business or pets or whatever, that's doing low-level interferences. It could be a big platform that's weeding out potentially terrorist content or actually terrorist content. There's such a wide range of potential reasons that that these activities should happen, that it goes back to, I think Ralph raised the question to Paddy, should we be regulating the goals? And I think the goals are significant because particularly when systems are being used for public policy reasons, we need to know if they're working or if they're not working, or if there's or if they're continuing to work. And that's come up in the e-privacy discussion in the Parliament recently about the voluntary measures. We need to have systems in place to know if measures that are being taken are actually working or not. And we can only do that with clear, consistent transparency across businesses and across time. And as Paddy was saying, that doesn't come from business. It's 2020 and we haven't seen business come up with coherent reporting mechanisms. The one exception being the Austrian Child Abuse and National Socialism Hotline, which has a magnificent transparency report that goes back over, I think, 15 years with a consistent methodology. And it's bizarre to see a small organization with limited funds do a better job than anybody else in European business in that area.
Yeah, where there's a will, there's a way. I think what is really lacking has been the will on the side of the companies and also the political will, because I think what Mackenzie said is very true, that for a long time, we have been looking at these tech companies sort of like gods, you know, well, whatever they do, it's like nature. And now we're realizing, well, we actually can regulate them and we should regulate them in order to save our way of living and our democracy. So I think there really has been a shift in the mood in the past years, but I totally agree. I would like to take, maybe Peter can be unmuted, so we try again if his mic works this time, and I would take one written questions because I've a little bit been neglecting the written questions. It's a question that says, democracy can be understood as the public having control over their services. Yeah, this is exactly what we're speaking about. Many services now employ algorithm-based software in their work, but invariably purchase this from the private sector. Might transparency be negotiated as part of contracting purchasing as compared to the free-for-all of individual clients in civil society? That's quite a relevant question. And then she adds, and what are the implications for service providers who claim to be engaging democratically with the public? So it's about having transparency requirement and public procurement, if I understand that correctly. That's interesting. Who would like to go for that? Jill, maybe? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's even a more relevant question than it seems, because there's a huge amount of procurement being done by governments. So by setting the standard, by firstly requiring systems that have good transparency options built in, but also being explicit about not being in the market for systems that do not allow proof of the lack of human rights harms, for example, would mean that the market would be driven towards better practices and having accountability by design. And it's something that that was stressed in the Council of Europe recommendation, which hopefully member states are going to follow up with.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting for the artificial intelligence debate as well, even more than just about social networks and content moderation. That's important. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Did you want to add on that, Mackenzie, or?
I just wanted to shamelessly plug some of the work of my colleagues who published a report a couple of weeks ago about public sector use of automated decision-making systems around Europe. Basically a deep dive into where these systems are being used. And they also have some policy recommendations for what the EU could do about it. Specifically, could be of interest would be the transparency registrars. So what we're calling for is for member states to disclose where they're using automated systems, because at the moment we just don't even know. And I can't get into the specifics because that's another one of my colleagues who worked on those, but I'll just drop it into the chat.
Great. Yeah, I would commend everybody to look in the chat because there's some documents linked. I think that's very interesting for everybody. So we try again with Peter. You need to unmute yourself and then you can speak. We still don't hear you. Nope. Sorry. There's probably something wrong with the settings. So you're unmuted and all should be well, but we're not hearing you. No, let's try Colin, who also had a written question, I think. Who's next in line? Jana, could you unmute Colin? And Peter, you keep trying. Colin, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks very much for putting this panel together and taking another question from me. Yeah, I'm kind of going back to an earlier discussion, but I think it's a really important one. I mean, just a background. I mean, I've spent 30 years working on algorithms, both 25 years on rule-based algorithms and last 5 years on machine learning. And as you'll all be aware, machine learning is a very fast-moving field anyway. But even if it wasn't, I do wonder how you can hope to have, transparency of algorithms when machine learning is basically about algorithms that are basically built up on data. If you look in the back blocks that is GPT-3, we've got 17 billion parameters, and huge data sets with 410 billion tokens from a common call. So, are we just going to end up satisfying our curiosity whilst the big tech companies just move on with the next thing?
Yeah, thank you very much. Who would like to answer that? Paddy and Mackenzie.
You go first. I went first last time, so go ahead, Mackenzie.
No, I just wanted to echo again what you said earlier, Paddy, about the importance of not just looking to the source code as kind of the holy grail of what it is that we should be interested in, both as the public, but also from the regulators' perspective. This is especially true for machine learning. So I'm not a technical expert, but I was in a webinar last night from my favorite AI blogger, Leerssen. I have her book here, so that's why I'm plugging it. She's brilliant, and she was meeting with some EU regulators to talk about AI weirdness and kind of how it is that she thinks the EU can lead. And because I know that there's a lot of talk, and Thierry Breton at the beginning of his remarks, he said that EU missed the boat on the behavioral advertising rush, and we can't afford to miss the boat on the taking advantage of industrial data. And then Leerssen came on, and she was basically pointing out all of the weird quirks that she's found in her research onto AI. And she said also very clearly that it's important to have kind of audits in place and for researchers to be able to access the output of what's coming out of these systems. And I think that's the main challenge. And that's also why we as Algorithm Watch are focusing our work in this area on getting access to kind of what's coming out of the system, because only then can you really understand what's happening behind the closed doors, I guess. And we're still at the beginning of thinking about what auditing systems could look like. I know that this has come up also in your reports from the Parliament, Alexandra. And I think that this is going to be a discussion that we'll have now for weeks. We've laid out in our recommendations some questions that we'd have about what you would need from any kind of auditing systems, who should be doing the auditing, who audits the auditor. And I think that's a really fascinating space to watch. I don't know if this answers the question about, I'd turn it over to you, Paddy.
Well, thanks, Colin. Basically, I couldn't agree more with this comment, and I think it's an important one. This is the kind of remarks you constantly get when you talk to people who actually work with machine learning, and that's why I also tried to emphasize in my talk that I think if you really focus our efforts exclusively on understanding the algorithm, we're really going to miss. It's going to be very hard, and it's going to miss the point to a large extent. And maybe to clarify what kind of tools might be useful, though, let me point to some examples from practice. And these are self-regulatory, so they still don't work as well as they should, but they are all starting to provide useful tools to understand these algorithmic systems. So, for example, we have now ad archives, such as the Facebook ad library. There's lots of problems with them. I've written a paper about all the problems they have. But the basic idea is you can now search and find all the different advertisements that Facebook sells, at least for their political ads. And you can see generally who bought it, how much they paid for it, who ended up seeing it. You still you have no idea how the algorithm worked, why it decided to show it to some people, and hopefully more could be done there. But this is a basic level of transparency that we didn't have before, which is already enabling journalists to do a lot of interesting research into who is spending money in elections, right? Something that used to be hidden in the black box, if you will. A similar tool is CrowdTangle, which is really helping journalists to trace what is trending on Facebook. These very interesting lists showing the extreme popularity of far right-wing content on US Facebook. That's something that wouldn't be possible without CrowdTangle. And these are the kinds of tools which I think provide a template for what transparency solutions, if properly regulated, would start to look like. And none of them are about understanding in detail why the algorithm made the decisions it did. It's about seeing what those decisions were and then trying to hold the platform accountable, even if you don't have the definitive proof. This being said, there are situations in which you do want that concrete proof. You want to be able to distinguish whether it's just like emergent bias from the users who seem to prefer something, or actually concrete meddling by the platform. For example, that is the case when you're looking at competition law and a case about self-preferencing. You know, the model here is Google Shopping. There you need to really get into the details and see, was Google's shopping product simply by the fair rules of the platform more popular than its competitors, or did Google give an unfair advantage to their own product? Right now, this is a very, very difficult question to answer and to research. And I see broadly two ways of doing it. Either you really bulk up the regulators' capacities to gather data, to analyze these tools and do the kinds of digital forensics that might help you answer these questions. Or we conclude that these questions are too hard to answer. These systems are too fundamentally complex to really hold accountable. And then you get to things like structural separation. What is now being proposed in India, for example, that you say the company that operates the search engine cannot also operate the shopping service. And you just separate the two, right? And that's a completely different way of thinking about the topic, where you say, forget about it. This is too complicated. We cannot hold it accountable. And we try to make bright line rules in other areas which minimize the possibility of abuse. So I think that's something maybe we can try both and see which is more effective on the long term. But there are ways of finding alternatives to algorithmic transparency as well.
Great, thank you very much. We need to wrap up. We're running a little bit late. Would you be okay with taking one more question? That's okay. It's a question from Isabel, Federation of German Consumer Organizations, because I think this is relevant because we mentioned this. A question for Paddy. Recommender systems also have a huge influence on product purchases. If consumers only see a fraction of products available, that is clearly a problem to their autonomy. So I wonder why Paddy rules out that transparency of recommender system would only be needed for interaction platforms and not online marketplaces like Amazon or Uber. Those were the ones mentioned. Thank you.
So I'm glad I get an opportunity to clarify that, because I don't think transparency should only be for the media platforms. As you say, it's super important that Amazon especially being such a huge player, but also other e-commerce, retail, gig economy platforms, transparency is vitally important. My point was rather that when we specifically talk about civil society and the public, about public transparency, this is something that's especially important for media platforms, because there is a lower degree of trust in regulators and experts when it comes to these very controversial and subjective questions of media policy. But when it comes to, for example, giving users rights, giving retailers rights vis-a-vis Amazon, and having proper regulatory structures in place, I absolutely agree that this is something that should also apply to non-media platforms.
Thank you very much. Unless there is any last comment from our panelists, if there's anything you would like to add that you didn't have the opportunity to say, then raise your hand now. Otherwise, I would try to wrap up. I would just to answer one more question that I couldn't take, Update Kada, could you come back tomorrow? Because I think your question is very specific to our tomorrow's topic and less to today's. So that would be great to bring it up tomorrow again. And with this, I could introduce what we're going to do tomorrow for those of you who have time to come back. 6 o'clock, our topic tomorrow will be ad tech, out of control. And we will have Johnny Ryan from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, Claire Malfoot, Global Disinformation Index, and Linda Warp and Tom von Bantheim from Ster Reklame, who developed a very interesting model for context-based advertisement for the Dutch public broadcaster. Excuse me, my voice. Here we go. And on Thursday, we have the third event of the DSA special series that's called Social Media Councils, Power to the People, with Roger McNamee, who was featured in The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and wrote Zucked, on Facebook and is part of the Real Facebook Oversight Board. Eileen Collodi from the Dublin City University and Pierre-François Dokier from Article 19, who I think was the organization that first brought up the idea of social media councils. Sorry, this is really time to end this. And with this, I hope to see you back tomorrow. A very heartfelt thank you to all our panelists. Thank you, Paddy. Thank you, Mackenzie. Thank you, Joe McNamee, for being with us tonight. I think this was highly informative, very, very interesting debate. And we see there are lots of open questions. Therefore, have a look at the chat. There's a lot of further reading I think we can do that was recommended to us from our speakers. And I think we can follow the discussion via Twitter. I think this discussion will be even more heated in the next month when the actual DSA and the Digital Markets Act as well on more the competition related issues will come up. So follow us, follow me on social media channels. I will be working on these topics. I will keep informing you on what's going on in the European Parliament and in the European institutions. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and yeah, unfortunately on Facebook. Subscribe to our newsletter, and you will receive a follow-up email in the next day with a link to the recording if you want to watch it again or recommend it to your friends. You have the possibility to do that. Goodbye, hope to see you tomorrow. And most important of all in these times, stay safe and stay healthy. Have a wonderful evening.